In my previous video, I showed you a few distress ink color combinations you can create with the mini ink kit number 3. The kit consists of the inks Antique Linen, Vintage Photo, Walnut Stain and Black Soot. Not the most exciting colors. Yet the kit number 3 is my must-have kit because the individual inks are very useful. And in this video, I will show you what else you can create using these inks. Let's start with the brown inks. I like to use them to help different pattern papers to blend better with each other. When I started card making, I used pattern papers a lot, and I did this all the time when I use pattern papers, so let me show you this technique. I picked these pattern papers. You can use whatever pattern papers you want. These are old papers that I bought years ago. I cut them into stripes in different sizes, and while these pattern papers are from the same pack, they are very different. And as you see, when I stuck them next to each other, even though they don't clash that much, it could be better. What I like to do is use a brown ink. Most of the time I use the Vintage Photo ink, and what I do, I cover the edges of the cardstock or the edges of each strip of the pattern paper. You can actually use ink that matches the color of the paper, but if you don't have the right color, the Vintage Photo is the best because it's neutral. I started blending with this makeup blending tool, and I applied the ink along the edges of the strip. And I didn't really like it. I didn't like the brown on the blue. It looked a little bit muddy. And then I remembered, because I didn't do this technique for a while, actually for a few years. First of all, I didn't have this tool to apply the inks back then. I only had the basic tool from Ranger. So I switched to that, and then I lifted the paper and really just applied the ink along the edges. It does a way better job because you get more saturated color along the edges. And that's where I want to have the color. And I did this for all the strips. I think the blending that I did at the beginning works better on a more vintage cardstock, but here it just did not work. This technique I learned from Jennifer McGuire. She used different inks, different brown and blue, but when I went to a shop to buy them, they only had the kit number 3. I don't even know if I knew which colors she used. All I knew she used brown. And ever since then, when I used a pattern paper, I used this technique. After I was done with the blending, I adhered all the strips together. Well, actually for a demonstration, I first put the strips together to see roughly how it will look. I put the strips randomly to cover the whole background. And to compare it with the stripes before I put the ink on, you can see here that with the brown, it just blends a bit better, at least in my opinion. Next, I glued all the stripes onto a white backing paper. Here I used a tape runner to adhere them, and I did this off camera. After I was done, I roughly cut the excess using my paper trimmer. Scissors might work better because the piece was constantly sticking to the trimmer, but I knew I was going to die cut the panel anyway, so I didn't need to have a nice cut, I just needed to trim it a bit. I ran the panel through a die cutting machine using a stitched rectangular die, and then I used the Vintage Photo ink again and covered the edges of the panel just to match the stripes. Lastly, I adhered the panel on top of a white card base using a liquid glue, and I used a stamped greeting that says Celebrate, and I attached it onto the panel using a foam tape. For the greeting, I used the primary bark embossing powder from Wow, and for the cardstock, I used the Nina Desert Storm. I fussy cut it, and I also used the Vintage Photo along the edges. And here is the finished card. It's fun, and the pattern papers really nicely blend together. And I actually found one more card where I did the same. I made this years ago and I have never finished it. I cannot decide on the greeting. But here I did the same. I applied a brown ink along the edges, either the Vintage Photo or Walnut Stain, I cannot remember, and it helps the pattern papers to blend better with each other. I have one more technique for pattern papers. and that is to make vintage pattern paper to look more vintage or aged. I think that would be a better word. I die cut a pattern paper using a stitched rectangular die. If you use a die, you need to do this first. And again, I used the vintage photo ink, but later I also added the Walnut Stain, and I covered the edges of the cardstock. When I was a school kid, we used tea bags or tea water to age the paper, or you would burn the edges of the paper, which I definitely don't want to do. Here I just blended the ink along the edges to give it a more aged look. This was inspired by a Father's Day card I made a few years ago, and I still had the pattern paper that I used for that Father's Day card, so I thought, let's make one more background. This is the pattern paper. Here I also cut it with a stitched rectangular die, and again I applied the ink along the edges. Here are the finished cards. For both I used die cut sentiments. It's an old die set. A lot of my supplies I'm using here are quite old. I die cut the words multiple times and I glue them on top of each other to make it more interesting. For the Mother's Day card, I could have used a red ink, but brown is neutral, so if you don't have red, brown should work. And here is the Father's Day card. I just love it because it is a replica of one of my first cards I ever made. This was on my old blog. So these are the techniques you can use with the brown inks. Next, I want to show you some uses I have for the black Soot ink. My main use for this ink is to make the colors along the edges darker. This works perfectly for a night sky. For example, this card. I used the black Soot at the top. Technically, you could use the inks from this kit to create similar background. This was a Halloween card and that's why I didn't recreate it. I used the black Soot at the top to blend it with the ink below to make it really dark. Then I created this blue night sky and I blended the black Soot along the edges again to make it darker. And the same I did on this card. Here I blended purple inks and the black Soot I blended along the edges. And if the black Soot is too intense or it doesn't work, you could use brown inks to make the color darker. For example, on this card, I used the brown on the outer edges. And the same I did on this Christmas card. I used the brown ink along the edges to create a really dark red. The next type of background you need the black Soot for is if you want to create galaxy backgrounds. Here on this card I did ink smooshing, but you can also do typical blending. The black Soot you use as last. My last technique is for the ink antique linen. What you can do with this ink is no line coloring. What that means is instead of stamping with a black ink and having black outline, you stamp with the antique linen ink and you will have beige lines that are still visible, but after you color the lines will blend with the color you are using and you won't see them. I stamped this image with tulips and as you see, the lines are visible but very light. So now let's color it. The best coloring products are watercolor products because distress inks can also be used as watercolors. They will blend with the watercolors better. You can use normal watercolors, watercolor markers, watercolor pencils, whatever is easier for you. You can also use distress inks if you want. And of course you can use normal pencils, Copic markers and so on. I used here normal watercolors to color the image. I had the idea to create yellow petals with a little bit of red in it. I did not do a great job. In the end I managed to get it together and I like it, but this was a spontaneous coloring. I didn't have a plan. This was supposed to be a quick sample. I did not plan to make a card, so it took me a while to focus. Plus, the cardstock was so annoying. I'm using the Canson XL. I know this is not a good watercolor paper, but I don't mind it. However, sometimes the cardstock doesn't take the water very well and the water just sits on top of it and it takes it a while to get absorbed. And the worst thing is I'm not really good at water management. So I was struggling a bit, but in the end I did get there and I really liked the result. After I was done with the normal watercolors, I used watercolor pencils. These ones are from Lidl, so nothing expensive. What I wanted to do is to enhance some of the lines inside of the petals and also between the petals to distinguish between each petal as they blended with each other. So I did the lines, I did also some finishing touches. I added second layer on the leaves and stems to make them darker. And here is the finished card. I added some splatter and I made a banner with a birthday greeting, and despite of some struggles, I think it looks very nice. And that's it. These are all the examples for which I use these inks. If you have more, let me know in the comments. I hope you found this video helpful and will try some of these techniques yourself. I would really appreciate if you gave this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And come back for more videos, that would really help. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in another video very soon.